I would like to introduce Dr. Jerry Milanich. Dr. Milanich is an emeritus professor at the University of Florida and Florida Museum of Natural History. He's also a contributing editor for Archaeology magazine, so if you enjoy that publication, you're probably very familiar with his name. He was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2010-ish. I think it was 2010. He's also the author of more than 20 books describing the Indian societies of the Americas and their interactions with Europeans during the colonial and post-colonial periods. And one of his books, we borrowed the title for today's program. One of his books is Laboring in the Fields of the Lord, Spanish Missions and Southeastern Indians. Of course, my own archaeological focus, I swapped those latter words and put Southeastern Indians first. As well as Florida's Indians from ancient times to the present. His most recent book, Handfuls of History, Stories About Florida's Past, was just published by the Florida Historical Society. He currently divides his time between New York City and a small village in the Catskill Mountains, and we're thrilled to have him down here in South Florida.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My assignment today is to use a big brush and provide you a quick overview of the Spanish missions that existed here in Spanish Florida. Spanish Florida, of course, encompasses not only the state of Florida, but at one time it was everything north and west of what our state is today, as far as knowledge went, even up to the Newfoundland area, and as far west as knowledge went, which was at the time not necessarily that much. When I was a graduate student, in the 1960s into the early 70s, I was told there's nothing left to be done on Spanish missions. We know it all. There were a couple of books out, one written in the 30s, one I think in the 60s. And it is absolutely amazing to me to see how much new knowledge and understanding has occurred since that, or has been uncovered since back then in the early 70s. And I think this is the first mission conference ever that has included not only historians and archaeologists, but we have a anthropological linguist here, Dr. Broadwell, who's, as you'll see, his research is, as well as that of my other colleagues, is just fascinating. He's bringing the language of the Temuco Indians back to life. Their story begins where I last left off a year ago, which is Pedro Menendez, who founded St. Augustine in 1565, having tossed the French out. And what's important is to understand his contract with the crown. It required him to establish settlements here in North America. And as a part of those settlements, he was required to, quote, educate the Indians, to bring the native peoples to Catholicism, to make them loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. To be Spanish was to be Catholic was to be a loyal member of the Spanish Empire. And so he set out to do that. Part of his knowledge was faulty. We, of course, didn't have North America explored at the time, and so there was a belief that if you went up Chesapeake Bay, you could find the fabled Northwest Passage to go across to China, to Japan, and you could then bring back the riches of those areas right across to the town of Santa Elena, which is under the Marine Officers Golf Course on Parris Island, South Carolina. But Menendez, after founding St. Augustine, found the town of Santa Elena up here about 2.5 years later, I think. And so his plan was to bring the riches back to Santa Elena and load them up on Menendez family ships and send them across the Atlantic to Spain. He also wanted to control the waterways of the southeastern United States so that ships coming back from New Spain that sailed the route here and across, if something happened, they wouldn't be, totally lost. They might wreck, but they could be found. And he also then wanted to see to the education, to the conversion of the native peoples. And to do that, he, in 1565, even before he came to Florida, contracted with, or made a deal with, the Jesuit order, which was a relatively new Catholic order founded in 1540. And so up to this date, up to the 1565, the Jesuits had been in, or were in, Portuguese colonies in South America, Japan, China, Philippines, and so North America was going to be their big splurge for a new land. Menendez also wanted to control the interior of Florida. He believed that the waterways connected. For instance, the St. Johns River came down to Lake Okeechobee, Miami River came down here, the Chattahoochee over here, the Hillsborough over here. And the first thing he did in Florida was to go out and set little settlements, little outposts at Mound Key, at the Calusa town of Escambaba, and also up here at Old Tampa Bay at an Indian town called Tocobaga. And sort of by luck, he ended up with another little settlement over here of Santa Lucia that was actually prisoners, and some of his men he couldn't feed, so it was easier to put them down there. And then some guys that had been in St. Augustine and deserted went into Miami to get fresh water, and 20 of them went ashore, and the rest of the buddies on the boat said, "See you later," and took off. So they got found by another Spanish ship, and their punishment was to having to stay in Miami. So some of you might still think that today. The first three Jesuit friars, Jesuit priests, came to Florida in early 1566 or maybe late 1565. They didn't do very well at first. They got lost. They couldn't find St. Augustine, the ship they were on. Went up to Cumberland Island, and one of the friars went ashore to find out where they were, talk to the Indians. The winds came up, blew the ship away, and he was essentially abandoned on Cumberland Island. And when they went back to find him sometimes later, he had been killed by the Indians. So already the Jesuits were down by 1/3. The two remaining Jesuits were then assigned, one to Escambaba, Mound Key, and the other to Tequesta, which was at Miami. And the guy who was the priest that was at Mound Key, Father Juan Rogel, R-O-G-E-L, I think is one of the most interesting people in the whole story of the colonization of Florida by Spain. And we heard a little bit about what went on there for last year. So 1568, things aren't going real good at these little outposts. Another handful of Jesuits had come to Florida. Rogel was pulled out of Mound Key, sent down to to Havana with another Jesuit to start a Jesuit school at which the chiefs in waiting of Indian groups would be taken and put there and turned into good Spanish-speaking loyal subjects. In other words, they were going to be indoctrinated. They took about 4 kids down, 3 or 4. Most of them died. It was a flop. They pulled out of there. Rogel goes back to the Mound Key, and then things just go bad. And the Jesuits pull out of both Tequesta at Miami and out of Mound Key. And about that time, I think another 9 or 10 Jesuits came, making 16 altogether who actually come here. One had already died. And they decide they're going to move up the coast to South Carolina and also along the coast to the area that's Raleigh, the Georgia coast. Things don't go well with those. And so the Jesuits decide in a very big, bold move, they are going to take 8 of their number and take them up to a place called Hacan on Chesapeake Bay. And with them, they took a Spanish boy, Alonso de Olmos, and also an Indian young man named Luis de Velasco. Luis de Velasco had been kidnapped in 1561 from the Chesapeake Bay by Spaniards, was taken to Cuba, then went to Veracruz, where he was baptized and given a Spanish name. And then he actually was taken to Spain, where he had a audience with the crown. And when Menendez came back to Florida in 1565, he evidently brought Luis de Velasco with him. And Luis must have told wonderful stories about the Chesapeake Bay, and if you want to find your way to China, that's the way to go. Let's go up there and I'll help you guys out. So the 8 Jesuits and these 2 guys, including Luis, land at Chesapeake Bay. The ship that brought them is sent off, and the sailors are said, you know, come back in several months, and when we see the ship, we'll build a fire, and you'll see the smoke, and you'll know where we are. So several months later, the Spaniards show up, and they don't see any fire, and they keep looking, and pretty soon they see several Indians wearing the robes of the Jesuits. And it was clear things had not gone well. And indeed, as they found out, all of them, as soon as the ship went away, Luis said bye-bye, went back to his old home. When the Jesuits went there to try to convince him to come back and help them out, the Jesuits were really killed. A fascinating story. Even more fascinating is that at least some scholars believe that Luis de Velasco is the grandfather of Pocahontas, that indeed his son then helped the Indians negotiate with the English colony that came there later, and then Pocahontas, who was wise in the ways of the West, learned this perhaps from her grandfather, but needs some work. So in other words, things did not go well for the Jesuits. Of the 16 people who came, the 16 friars, 9 were killed. And so in 1571, the Jesuits decide to pull out. Some of their number go to Brazil, some go back to Spain. I'm not sure that that's ever been studied in depth. What happened to the, what's 16 minus 9? That's 7. What happened to all 7 of those people, where they went? 1573, Menendez then convinces the Spanish crown to ask the Franciscan order to send friars. And so from that time on, it was the Franciscan friars, the members of the Franciscan order that were in Florida. A handful of friars came in 1573, and more were dibs and dabs. But it wasn't until 1595 that a significant number came. And the decision was made by Spanish authorities in St. Augustine that they would really concentrate on educating, converting the Indians that lived in Wally on the Georgia coast, spelled G-U-A-L-E, although there's a little tidal stream up there, it's spelled Wally, W-A-L-L-E-Y, Wally's leg, like Wally Cleaver in the old Leave It to Beaver show. It's one of my favorite ones. The Timucua-speaking Indians who were in southeast Georgia and North Peninsula Florida, and the Appalachee Indians over here around Tallahassee. So they thought that they would put missions in those areas. And they started out in 1595 by putting a series of missions in a north-south line, starting down here at a large Indian village that today we call it the archaeological site of Mount Royal. Another one up here near the mouth of the St. Johns River, and then on up the coast on the Sea Islands, almost all the way up to the mouth of the Savannah River. And things didn't go along swimmingly, and as you'll hear from our next speaker, Dr. Francis, there was I hate to call it magnificent, but an extraordinary rebellion in 1597 that he has helped us to learn much, much more about. Then beginning in 1607, the decision is made, let's move into the interior, into those Timucua Indian areas. And beginning in 1607, the first mission is San Francisco de Botano. And in general, missions were named for the feast day of the saint when the mission was consecrated. So San Francisco was founded on the day of St. Francis, and then they would put the day on it of the town. So San Francisco de Botano was the mission of San Francisco in the Indian town of Botano. We have down here Santa Maria of the Angels in the town of Arapaha, and so forth. Well, how did these missions actually go? How did they get them started? They used the old-fashioned method. They bribed the Indians. John Worth has showed in his research that a contingent of Franciscan friars and military officials and others, Spaniards, would march out from St. Augustine to go to a main town like San Francisco de Patano, which is near Gainesville, and give gifts to the Indians and invite the chief and some of his family or other important Indians to come to St. Augustine. They would come to St. Augustine, they'd throw a party for them, give them gifts, things like metal tools, Spanish men's clothes, flour made from wheat, baptize the priest and some of his people, give them a Spanish name, and go back to their village, and the Indians would have to agree then to take a friar in. Well, you can imagine, the guy goes back to San Francisco, and the chief from the next town comes over, where'd you get that neat loot? Ah, it's easy. You just go to St. Augustine and say you'll be a Christian, and they'll load you right up. And so there are documents that indicate that some of the Indian towns actually asked for friars, and there weren't enough. But anyway, between 1607 and about 1615 or 20, all of these 22 or so Spanish missions were founded from up here, the confluence of the Ocmulgee and Oconee rivers, okay, to down here into the general Ocala area. Then in 1633, they make the decision to move farther west among the Appalachian Indians and set up the missions in northwest Florida. So it was a very systematic process and well thought out. It was not haphazard. Well, what did the missions look like? They were I call them houses of straw. They were nothing like, they were elaborate and quite imposing, but they were not like the stone missions, or maybe their masonry, in California. If you've been to San Juan de Capistrano, it's still there. In Florida, fires and time simply obliterated the missions and the mission structures. All of them seem to have been wattle and daub. Wattles are the branches that are woven together to make the walls, and then they would just simply take wet clay and put it on them, and then you could smooth it. You could actually paint it, plaster it, paint it, so they look like quite nice things. But when they're gone, they're gone. This is, you're standing in the part of a mission here on Amelia Island, and as you can see, there's absolutely nothing there. You just see nothing above ground. And in fact, the locations of all the missions, except the one in Tallahassee, and actually this one, the exact locations were lost through time until archaeologists in their white hats showed up and began to find them. It's not true. We worked on that mission on Amelia Island, and when we started, I went and looked in the card catalog, the University of Florida, under missions. I said, you know, you never know. And it says, oh, here's a map. I said, what? It shows the setup of the mission, where we were. It shows the church, a convento, which is the friary, or where the Spanish priest would live when they were there, a kitchen and a separate building, so if the fire didn't go right, you wouldn't burn everything down. This one purportedly had a barracks for several Spanish soldiers who were there to help protect the Indians, but most remarkably, it had a palisaded wall with earth-ramped, what do we call those things in the corners? What do we call? Bastions, thank you. And it had a moat. And so we said, hot dogs. Oh, and it had a scale in varas, which are, one vara is about a yard. Well, I said, any idiot archaeologist can find this. You can find a moat. So we dug for several weeks and didn't find any moat. And the historian we were working with said, oh my goodness, I just found some documents that said, well, we never actually built all that. They said, well, we couldn't find enough wood, and we didn't have anybody to work, and, you know, the students were out fishing, or how that is. And, but they had sent us to the Crown to say what a huge success they were. So how do you find those missions if you don't know what they are? You just go out and look, and take corings and everything else, and look for artifacts, and look for the burnt daub, or the dried daub that was on the walls of them, and this is the kind of thing you found, simply burnt timbers in the ground. We often use metal detectors because they use nails and other hardware to hold these things together. The nails were made and brought usually from St. Augustine. And they find wonderful things. This is a crystal cross about 1.5 to 2 inches tall, found at one of the Appalachian missions. My personal favorite artifact, which was a thing that looks like a brass doorknob about 4 inches long, that's actually a seal for putting a seal on letters or other documents. This is it reversed, and this was found at the mission of Santa Catalina, and this says abbreviated Saint Catherine, Santa Catalina, martyr of Alexandria. Saint Catherine in the 4th century was tortured on a wheel in Egypt, I believe it was, and then her head was chopped off with a sword. But St. Catherine was very popular among the Franciscans, but I read recently she's been de-beatified, this particular St. Catherine, so I felt badly. But now every place I go in the world, I look in museums, and here I found a painting of St. Anthony's at his writing desk, and look, right here is his seal thing, but look at that also. So this makes it I can deduct my trips everywhere whenever I find that. And I'll go rapidly here. There are lots of Spanish ceramics that the priests used for themselves. When they ran out of Spanish material, they got the Indians to make bowls and plates out of regular old clays that the Indians used to build their own pottery vessels and that. But at these sites, we find just wonderful things. At some of them, but not all, you find literally, in some cases, tens of thousands of glass beads. And we puzzled over this, why at some towns and not at others. I think that this is essentially loot that the Spaniards used to pay off certain chiefs. And it turns out that one of the main functions of missions was to serve as a recruiting device for labor. The authorities in St. Augustine would tell the chief of mission, San Francisco de Botano, send 22 adult males over. We need them to work in town for 2 months. And they'd go and end up having to work 6 months. But they were required by law to pay. And so what do? Give lots of beads to the chief, who may have passed them out to other people or kept them. One thing we find at Temecula missions, and I don't know if it's true over in Appalachia, are these little pits about 6 inches around, and they're chock full of charred corn cobs. These little bitty ones that look like this. This is from Public Supermarket. Now I deduct my trips to Public. Here's a charred peach pit and a modern one. But what are all these corn cobs doing? One of those little pits has produced more charred corn cob that has been found at all pre-Columbian sites in Florida all time ever. Well, what we've learned because of John's research and that of other people is that the missions were used to grow corn, to pound the kernels into flour and transport it to St. Augustine to help build the people in St. Augustine. It was also a way for friars to make money. They could sell some of it. They took vows of poverty, so they didn't have cash, but they could get credit in St. Augustine. Even some of the Indian chiefs themselves would arrange for corn flour to be transported to St. Augustine. Well, what do you do with all the old cobs that are hanging around? You use them for fuel. And maybe they were getting rid of mosquitoes or something. But the use of Indians for labor was extraordinary. And I go until 9:40? Yep. Oh, thank you. I'm in good shape here. For instance, the Castilla de San Marcos was really built in large part with Indian labor. They mined the coquina mines over on Anastasia Island. They helped to hew the trees to get the wood to build the fort and so forth. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the mission Indians to St. Augustine. And let's see, I forgot why I put this one on, so we'll just go to the next one. We've also found the actual remains of the mission Indians themselves interred in the floors of the churches, laid out in nice Christian fashion. Here's one holding the crucifix, a little cross on his chest. He was buried in a shroud, and part of the shroud is still preserved there by the little cross. And sometimes the shrouds were hooked with little straight pins that have been found. Occasionally, very important Indians were interred in wooden coffins, but we've worked closely, all the archaeologists and the historians, with the Franciscan order, and these are Christian Indians. They're Catholics, and so they have been reinterred all over the place. Well, in 1656, there's a rebellion that John's going to talk about, and what happened was, as the populations decline, they don't need all of these missions, and after the rebellion, they reorganized the missions in Temecula along a road, the main Camino Real that stretched from St. Augustine across to Appalachia. I think of them as little holiday inns on the road, and so they became stopover points so that people walking back and forth from Appalachia, bringing corn or supplies, could spend the night at these locations. And when I was a student, this was what we knew about the missions. This was, everyone told us, and as John's research showed, it was greatly different. Well, the mission Indians themselves are Catholics. They knew the doctrine. They knew the Catholic doctrine. A lot of them probably learned Spanish. Some even learned Latin. And that's one of the reasons why the missions are called doctrinas and so forth. Well, then one last slide here, which is an anecdote that I think illustrates what it was like to be a mission Indian. You were not a traditional Indian. You were not a Spaniard. You were a mission Indian. 1676, there's a series of documents from Appalachia. The authorities learned that the Appalachia Indians are playing a traditional kickball game where one village would challenge another to this game, and they'd beat the heck out of each other. And it was surrounded by, centuries-old practices and rituals and accoutrements that they wore and everything else. An amazing set of documents. Some of the priests thought it was a wonderful thing because it was lots of fun to watch, like watching a soccer match or something. They outlawed it. But while this is going on in Appalachia, a few years later, two Appalachia Indians happen to be in St. Augustine. One works there on a farm, and one is visiting, and they're walking down the street and kicking, and what do they see? A broken pewter plate, like one you could buy in St. Augustine today. And one of them goes, they take it home, take some wood, carve a mold, melt down the pewter, and make counterfeit half real coins. So then they get another Indian to go into a French pastry shop and pass a counterfeit coin to buy pastries, which they go outside and eat and say, wow, we're in the business. Well, unfortunately, the next day, a woman comes in and they give her the counterfeit coin, and she says, hey, this is counterfeit. So they set a trap. When the guys come back to get their pastry the next day, they nab them and they get in trouble. But look at this. They understand coins and how to make counterfeit coins, and they like Spanish pastries. And so here's this magnificent, I think, juxtaposition of the old and the modern and their place in it. Thank you very much. And this afternoon I'll be talking, I have the depressing part of the program where we talk about what happened to the mission Indians. Thank you very much.
Don't go away. We have set aside 10 minutes in between talks for questions, so we welcome people to come on up and ask questions.
You mean I had 10 more minutes?
If no one asks you any questions, you have 10 more minutes.
Okay, I don't need it. Are there any questions? Yes.
How old is Mound Key?
No one knows. Most of us would guess that the earliest occupation there was as old as anything else in this area, which is at least several thousand. But several thousand years ago, there are on Usepa Island, there's an archaeological site that's probably about 5,500 years ago, people came. There were smaller numbers. They lived around in good locations, and then people make more people, and then they keep building on the site. So Mound Key could be as old, we just don't know. The excavations had not been done, and someday they will be, and come back and we'll answer that question. You can have us all back. Yes?
Thank you for coming down, Jerry. A lot of friars were very good at wine and beer making. Corn makes a nice chicha. All South America, is there any evidence in the New World at this point?
Well, not from the Southeast that I'm aware of. That's a great problem to ask a great question for one of these historians later. I know that they did take oil that they needed for lamps and also wine that they needed for communion and that from St. Augustine to the missions. And if I had to live in a dirt floored hut out there near Gainesville, I would be sampling the communion wine, quite frequently. But that's another great question that we don't know all the answers. We know a lot, and the more we know, the more we can ask, the more we can know. So this is a long process, but I think a wonderful one. And most exciting for me is the number of other scholars now that are involved in mission research and the number of students. For every faculty person that we have, you have what? 10 graduate students or something. So a tremendous amount of work has been done. And right now in Florida, I have another couple minutes, exciting discoveries, not only bringing back this Native American language to life once again, but the research you've been reading about in the newspapers over at University of West Florida, with John and his folks are working on a DeLuna village, attempt to colonize Northwest Florida beginning in 1559, and the hurricane hit the supply ships, 6 of them that were sank, and now they've found the 3rd one of those 6. And so this is giving us information on what these settlement expeditions look like. And the other discovery that's been in the news is I mentioned that when Menendez came to Florida in 1565 and threw the French out of their fort at the St. Johns River, one of their French ships was escaping down the coast, got caught in a hurricane, and wrecked somewhere around Cape Canaveral, the Trinité, which was Jean Ribault's ship, and that has now been found and is there just offshore, and is an incredible discovery that over the next few years, after the international lawyers deal with all the ramifications, I'm sure we'll be hearing about. But I mean, to me, this is like finding the pyramids. It's incredible new information and discoveries that are being made. Thank you very much, and we'll be on schedule.
There was one more question, sir.
I was interested in your sources. Where do you find the written materials, and are there more of those that have not been found yet that you would be looking for?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. He asked where do we find these documents? How do we know this, and are there more? And the answer is historians, people like Michael Francis, John Worth, many others, not many others, but others before them, have been in the archives in Spain and Sevilla, some archives in Madrid, the Vatican, Cuba. And it's not an easy task, as we'll hear this afternoon from Michael, looking at them. I look at some and they look like they could be in Arabic to me, the early ones. I can't make out one word. If they have nice handwriting, it gets a little easier, but it's still very difficult. And yes, there's always more material that may not be in a state archive, it may be in a private library. Discoveries are always being made. And that's another very exciting part of all this, are these new discoveries. And now that things are getting better with Cuba, it may be that many more things will come out of there. I should also say in Mexico there's been archival work done for Florida. And so people like Michael Francis and others actually, is this making funny noises? Or is that me? Oh, it's me. have put them on microfilm, and so now you can go to universities or online and see a lot of the material to work with, and which means you can't go to tapas bars in Sevilla and look yourself. But these are just amazing times at what we're learning. And